Great, thank you. So I think we started to look at that point as journeys as a system, in that there are lots of different things that are linked up in our one experience. But so what? We did something similar to this a little while ago around, and we imagined a journey in the future. And we did what we did here, and we created a story out of it saying, this is somebody's journey in the future. And we showed it to a few people and they said, well, that's great. We really like that. But you know what? We need to get the trains out on time and we need to get the tickets sold and we need to update the timetable. Transport's very operational. You just got to keep it going. And there's no bandwidth to think about this kind of stuff. And this stalled me for a long time. And then I suddenly started to think, well, maybe we need to come up with some kind of tool. And I hate to use the word tool, but let's just use it for now. And I began to think, well, maybe one of the biggest chances is to kind of borrow from other people and do some kind of measuring and tracking of exclusion reduction. So those things that we just talked about, they're potential exclusions. What if we could find ways of reducing them? Well, we've done a lot of work around reducing them over the decades, but there's really no way to organize those thoughts and actions and plans and strategies across the whole journey. They tend to be quite siloed. They tend to be during a connection or at the bus stop or on the bus. And nobody's really responsible for the whole journey. We've got lots of responsibilities for those different silos and lots of different targets for those silos. But when we join them up, does it make a proper journey? Does it make a good journey for everybody? So what can we do to borrow from somebody else to do this really quickly? Well, it turns out that the very thing that we're trying to incorporate exclusion reduction into is actually pretty well organized, and that's emissions reduction. So we want people to, before they do their stuff around emissions reductions, to think, hang on, what do we need to do to make sure that we reduce exclusions at the same time? Well, the emissions reductions world is really well organized. It's well defined. It's an industry, right? There are protocols, there are frameworks that allow organizations to identify their greenhouse gas emissions, who's responsible for them, where they occur, and how to plan how to reduce them. And they've got organizations that oversee this and advise and hold those commitments to account. So I thought, well, why don't we just borrow some of that? So here's a definition of the greenhouse gas protocols. Now, don't worry about all the wording and stuff, but just kind of get the sense of it. I'll read it out. The greenhouse gas protocols are a comprehensive, global, standardized framework for measuring and managing emissions to enable greenhouse gas reductions across the board, so in a system. Organizations should do an inventory of their emissions and identify them as direct or indirect emissions classified as scopes 1, 2, and 3. So you might have heard about scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. What if we mirrored that in the world that we're thinking of? What if we just borrowed that wording and replaced emissions with exclusions? What if we said, right, we've got some exclusion protocols now. It's a comprehensive global standardized framework for measuring and managing exclusions to enable exclusion reductions across the board, so across the system. Organizations should do an inventory of the exclusions and identify them as an indirect or direct exclusion classified as scope 1, 2, and 3. So what if we borrowed what they're doing over in the emissions reduction world and kind of search and replace for exclusions? Now, don't worry about the detail of this, but I'm going to tell you that scope 1 emissions means that's something that we're highly responsible for. I own that vehicle. It's pumping out diesel. I need to change it, and only I can change it. Scope 2 is slightly kind of removed responsibility. I don't own it, but I use it. So if I buy in electricity, I can change. I'm not responsible for the power station, but I can buy in cleaner electricity. And scope 3 is kind of everything else, which is really difficult to do. But we do have responsibility for some of the emissions that we create, even though we don't own the stuff that is making those emissions and we don't actually use them. We actually have some kind of responsibility for them. If we created something similar for exclusions, what might it sound like? Well, scope 1 exclusions, we absolutely own that. We own that bus, right? It doesn't have a ramp, so we need to get a ramp, and nobody else is going to get that ramp. So that's our responsibility. Scope 2, we don't own the things that cause those exclusions, but we use them and they're part of our service. So actually, we've got a role to play in reducing those exclusions. And scope 3 exclusions, we don't own them, we don't use them, but actually, if people can't navigate them, they'll never make it to our service. So we have some kind of responsibility to make sure that, the broken pavement 3 miles away, actually, that's part of our system that we're working in, not part of our service, but as part of our system. So I've been thinking, well, if we could create those two things, sorry, that one thing, and line it up with the emissions. So if we link emissions reductions activities with this new model of exclusion reduction activities, then maybe we can start putting some arrows between them to say, well, look, you've identified your emissions, you've identified who's responsible for reducing them, but hang on, before you do anything, think about what else you have to do around reducing exclusions before you go on to the next stage, before you make your plan, before you take your action. Before you buy that bus, think about before you buy that electric bus, think about what exclusions that can be reduced through demanding new designs in the meantime. And who do you need to talk to get this right? So what I was going to ask you to do, and let's have a look, it's now 10:02. So let's take a few minutes. Let's start this up until 2 o'clock, and then we'll take a break. Let's just make an introduction to this. I'm going to put you into groups and ask you to have a look at, it's basically a table. And I've created something that is like it's the starting point for creating an exclusion reduction plan, if you like. And it's my imagination, but it's there to be pulled apart and put back together and rebuilt in whatever way you like. But this is the hard bit because we need to use our imagination. We need to avoid being trapped by the present. We need to ignore our budget constraints. You need to forget all of the systems that are in place at the moment. Things that stop progress, things that, frameworks that constrain you. Try really hard to forget. It's really hard. Jeff Morgan talks about finding a space in which to think thoughts that don't yet exist. And I would really like you to use this opportunity to think thoughts that haven't existed before. Okay, so let's find that space. Let's go back into Miro. And there's a bit of explanation there, but what I'm going to ask you to take one of the exclusions that you've identified, put it into this table, and then see what happens from there. Hopefully it will become clear once you get there. So back into groups for